Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Sarah Ray. I'm the Adult Services Librarian at the Bloomfield Public Library. Thank you all for coming out tonight via Zoom for one of our larger programs, virtual programs happening. We are very excited to be partnering with the Winterberry Historical Society tonight and having Dr. Traci Parker speak about her book. So I'm going to turn this over to Ruth Ann, and she will do an introduction.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming tonight. And this is an exciting new venue for all of us, less so for Sarah Ray, who has been wonderful and having lots of Zoom things from the library. And we are very much, Sarah, we are in your debt. Without you, this couldn't have happened. And I must say that not having Dr. Parker come would have been a great loss. Ron and I went to the Connecticut Historical Society last year, and we were lucky enough to hear Dr. Parker speak. And I sort of felt like one of those fans that goes up to the star afterward and said, Dr. Parker, please, 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 can you come to Bloomfield? And she said, sure. So I was so excited about it. But we wanted very much to have her come and represent the Winterberry Historical Society, speak to us, because her topic is a very important American topic. It's also a very important Bloomfield topic, because Bloomfield's lucky enough to have a good portion of African-American middle-class people who've been here for generations now. And in the Historical Society, those of you who know about us, we're not open yet, but we will be again. And we try very much to have not just old-fashioned ideas about history, but historical data that really has to do with the real and the important, including right now. So if you have stories of your COVID-19 experiences, we want to know. But getting back to Dr. Parker's work, she talks about the importance of department stores as a gateway for people, women, African-American women, a gateway into the middle class. And we are fortunate enough that Dr. Parker understands a lot about Connecticut department stores, because when she researched at the Connecticut Historical Society, she did lots of research about G. Fox and lots of research about Mrs. Auerbach. And for many of you who might be listening tonight, and many who will hear this video later, Mrs. Auerbach was a rather instrumental woman in helping many women in particular, but people really achieve things that they never could have achieved. And the whole G. Fox thing is its own magical Hartford thing. But I think we need to really remember that, and to also know that we're listening tonight to a published author and a professor. And I want to read a little bit about her book, because I think it's important for you to hear the book that's been published, to say nothing of what will come later. We're not sure, but many things. She's the author of the book, Department Stores and the Black Freedom Movement, Workers, Consumers, and Civil Rights from the 1930s to the 1980s. And that's quite a stretch. And for somebody my age, I may not remember the 30s much, but I certainly do remember in the 60s that those civil rights movements where people went to lunch counters, et cetera, many of them were in department stores and drugstores, and important things happened there. And Dr. Parker examines the movement to racially integrate white-collar work and consumption in American department stores, and she broadens our understanding of historical transformations in African-American class and labor formation. Built on the goals, organization, and momentum of earlier struggles for justice, the department store movement channeled the power of store workers and consumers to promote Black freedom in the mid-20th century, sponsoring lunch counter sit-ins and protests in the 1950s and 60s, and challenging discrimination in the courts in the 1970s. This movement ended in the early 1980s with the conclusion of the Sears, Roebuck and Company affirmative action cases and the transformation and the consolidation of American department stores. In documenting the experiences of African-American workers and consumers during this era, Dr. Parker highlights the department store as a key site for the inception of a modern Black middle class, and demonstrates the way that both work and consumption were battlegrounds for civil rights. I can't thank you enough, Dr. Parker, for being with us. And also, even more than that, for taking this on as an area of study. We all have so much to learn, and from the past, and as we move forward, we need to remember those voices. So thank you for being with us, and thank you, Sarah.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming out. I really want to thank Ruth Ann. As she mentioned, we met it was about a year ago at the Connecticut Historical Society, and she invited me to give a talk, and I was thrilled to do so, and I feel very honored to be here today. I also want to thank Sarah Ray and the Winton Berry Historical Society and the Bloomfield Public Library for getting this all together in the midst of this pandemic. So I'm going to share my screen so we can, plenty of images to show. Sarah, can you tell me, do you see the whole screen or just, should I make it share?
Yeah, I would do the slideshow.
Okay.
Yep.
There we go. Perfect. Thank you.
Yep.
So today I'm going to be speaking a bit about my book, Department Stores and the Black Freedom Movement, Workers, Consumers, and Civil Rights from the 1930s to the 1980s, which considers the role of department store labor and consumption in the civil rights movement and the emergence of a modern Black middle class in the mid and late 20th century. And by modern, I mean class identity that is grounded in consumer capitalism, for which department stores were exemplars, if not leaders. And this is a class identity that is not grounded in industrial capitalism, which shaped African American class experiences before the 1950s, 1960s. And so that would have been very much grounded in domestic work and factory work. The story that I tell is important to understanding the economic dimensions or the economic agenda of the civil rights movement. Historians have overwhelmingly argued that the civil rights movement focused on ending public discrimination and segregation and the psychological stigma of state-enforced racial classifications, a reality exemplified by the integration of eating facilities and other public accommodation. The movement, they have posited, was a single attack on Jim Crow and not as a more broad-based critique on racial capitalism. And my book disagrees with this. It finds that the movement was committed and actively involved in the struggle to end racial and economic oppression. All of this is apparent in the space of the department store. Simply, Black protests that targeted department stores and other sites of consumption advanced Black labor and consumption, and thus the overall Black economic condition in the 20th century. So I want to begin just to give you a sense. I came to this topic, maybe subconsciously, because my family spent a lot of time in department stores. As a child, I grew up in the 80s and I grew up in Baltimore. My mother's favorite department store was Heck Company, which was a department store that was really big in Baltimore and Washington, D.C. area and is now a Macy's, as everything is a Macy's now, it seems. And every Saturday, after she picked us up from dance class or whatever, art class or whatever we were doing, we would go to the mall. My sister and I, in tow, would go with my mother begrudgingly to the mall. And she would have the same ritual. She would park outside of the Hex shoe department. She would walk in. She would spend what felt like hours looking for shoes. With my sister and I trying on shoes or reading the book that we had brought from home. And then she would make her way to the clothes department, whether it be a women's clothes or children's clothes, and then home's goods. And so she would sort of tour the department store before she went to another department store in the mall, another department store that may have anchored the mall. During the 80s, my mother also worked at Heck Company in the handbag department. And so we spent a lot of time, more than I actually want to admit, in department stores. So when I began thinking about department stores, and this actually started when I was in graduate school at the University of Chicago, I had read a book on department stores. It's a wonderful book by William Leach called Land of Desire. And in the book, he talks about New York and Philadelphia department stores. And literally, there might be like 2 sentences on Black people, which just seemed like something was wrong, right? I had grown up in department stores. Not only did my mother spend all this time in department stores, we would run into my grandparents who would get up first thing in the morning to like walk the mall for exercise and then begin shopping at the department stores. Um, so we have a lot of history. We have a lot of history there. And so what was glaringly omitted was African Americans. And what I knew was that for my parents, for my grandparents, like most Americans, department stores informed their lives. For the better part of the 20th century, department stores were arbiters of middle class life and aspiration, as well as instruments of social mobility and maintenance. Retailers erected stores of unprecedented size and opulence that demanded to be seen as well as to be seen in. So I'm showing you here a couple of images of G. Fox and Company in Hartford, Connecticut. I just am always mesmerized by how ornate and glamorous these old department stores were, especially when you consider what's going on now, which I'll talk about towards the end of my talk. Retailers confronted customers with both an astounding array of high-quality, stylish merchandise and lavish services that enticed customers to buy much more than the essentials. They mastered the art of creating and satisfying customers' personal desires and indoctrinating them with the belief that an urban bourgeoisie lifestyle could be realized and flaunted through shopping. Department stores offered numerous services and amenities so that customers spent the entire day there. Right? So initially at the turn of the 20th century, when they're starting to build these department stores, the idea that this would be a place for white middle-class women in particular, it would be sort of like their club, their day club. Men had their clubs. The department store would do that for women. And so under one roof, you could find clothes. You could have lunch at the restaurant, at the store restaurants. You could buy your groceries. There was a bakery. There was a post office. In some, there were hospitals, barbershops, beauty shops, shopping assistants, nurseries for shoppers' children, a bus service, shoe shining, and just so much more. And not only are you getting all of these amenities in one place, this is a moment where shopping and selling was an art, I would say. Right? You had trained salespeople who understood how to cater to their customers. You would go in and you think you'd want something, and it was the job of the salesperson to figure out what you actually needed or desired, or how to get you to spend a little more money than you came in thinking you would. And so they understood the good, the merchandise that they were selling. There is a story of New York department store workers who actually, the salesmen used to have to learn a little bit of French. So that way they would make their customers feel like they were having an experience. To shop in these places was something that is unimaginable, especially to my students who are now in their late teens, early 20s. People got dressed to go shopping, right? This was certainly a place to be seen. And you felt as though when you walked into a department store that you really were going to be cared for. You were going to be served. Shopping and working in these cathedrals of consumptions afforded white people, for whom the stores were actually created, at all social levels, opportunities to enact an ostensibly common racial and class identity. The idea that consuming and displaying white middle-class accoutrements and behaviors were there in order to diminish differences and create or affirm an elevated social status. And so I want to read to you a little bit from my book, just to give you a sense of what that was. With the purchase of an elegant dress and complimentary shoes, hat, and jewelry, a woman could temporarily escape her woes, such as the neglectful spouse, unappreciative children, or the humdrum activities of her daily life. And one afternoon, with store clerks anticipating and attending to her every wish, she could transcend her reality and shed any existing feelings of worthlessness, disappointment, and boredom. Happiness, comfort, prosperity, class mobility, social superiority, attractiveness, and even sexual appeal could be hers, if only for a few moments. The working class woman also, could find some relief from her daily struggles in the department store. She could escape the drudgery of wage slavery by wandering store aisles, looking, desiring, fantasizing, and finding solace in what could be hers someday. So simply put, department stores treated customers to various luxuries and services. They were places of consumption, leisure, and work. They were sites for self-fashioning, self-expression, and human satisfaction. But more than this, department stores enthroned consumption in the 20th century as a route to democracy and citizenship. And it invited everyone, regardless of race, class, gender, age, and country of origin, to enter, browse, and purchase. Just before I move on, I wanted to give you a couple more images of G. Fox that I was able to find at the Connecticut Historical Society. So even as department stores celebrated this democracy, they were in fact Jim Crow institutions. African Americans were initially hired only in menial positions, such as maid, janitors, cooks, and elevator operators, though a few eventually moved up to white-collar jobs in sales and offices. Meanwhile, African American customers were often welcome to shop, but they were provided unequal service and found their movements and participation in the usual shopping experience severely constrained. They were routinely refused service at lunch counters, restaurants, and beauty shops, prohibited from trying on and returning clothes, denied credit, and could be arbitrarily refused entrance or service at any moment. As places of both employment and consumption, department stores promoted a racialized democracy and simultaneously and inadvertently exposed the blatant contradictions of Jim Crow society, espousing democratic ideals. Consequently, these stores became optimal sites for Black resistance to discrimination at work and leisure. African Americans organized the department store movement, a potpourri of campaigns that varied across time and space, in leadership, size, tactics, and organization. This movement aimed to secure for Blacks, like my mother and myself, the right to freely experience all that this industry and American consumer culture offered. It promised not only to dismantle Jim Crow, but also facilitate the growth of a modern Black middle class and advance Black economic freedom and well-being. Movement leaders understood that Jim Crow was particularly vulnerable in department stores, especially at this historical juncture when ordinary Americans' realization of true democracy had become intricately tied to their identity as consumers. African Americans leveraged their collective labor and buying power, employed various protest strategies, including persuasion, boycotts, and picket lines, and obeyed the canons of bourgeoisie respectability to fully integrate their demands for equal treatment as both workers and consumers. The department store movement began in the late 1930s as an outgrowth of the Don't Buy Where You Can't Work movement, which you see here. Adam Clayton Powell is located right center, holding the sign that says "An appeal, please stay out." And so this is a photograph of the Don't Buy Where You Can't Work movement in Harlem in about 1941, it's estimated. The movement itself was spearheaded by African American consumers, whereby they withheld their patronage, their dollars from businesses, white-owned businesses in Black communities that refused to hire African American sales workers or clerical workers. Department stores were like its predecessor, in that it fixated on department stores in and out of neighborhoods. Department stores were a place and be seen. Two, the department's wavering color line made this space racially ambiguous, contradictory, and vulnerable. In many ways, it made Blacks equal to whites as consumers, offering them occasions to browse through and dream of purchasing luxurious commodities, to be waited on by white sales workers, and even secure employment considered a step above domestic and factory work. They met and engaged whites not as servants, but as punitively equal shoppers, all of this, African Americans insisted by the start of World War II, was key to achieving and demonstrating social mobility and equality. During World War II, the department store movement broadened its reach to recruit the power of store workers and labor unions. It took advantage of wartime personnel shortages and retailers' desire to show wartime patriotism. And it also leveraged the Double V campaign, which was an African American initiative that spotlighted the contradictions between American domestic and foreign policy on the issues of democracy and political freedoms. They did all of this to compel many store managements to re-examine the racialized organization of their labor forces. These campaigns were particularly successful in Philadelphia, Boston, and other northern cities. But in the case of Hartford, Connecticut, it appears that store management were more easily persuaded by African Americans and didn't require the use of boycotts or picket lines. At G. Fox Company in Hartford, Connecticut, store president Beatrice Fox Auerbach was committed to employee advancement and believed in store training programs and promotions from within. Her philosophy, however, was not exclusive to white workers. So in 1942, G. Fox began employing Black executives and sales workers. 3 years later, as Black employment expanded, the store hired Anarthia Shaw to manage its personnel of color, although Shaw resigned just after 2 years to tend to her family. Sarah Murphy, a former Women's Army Corps member and graduate of New York University's Personnel Administration program, then assumed the position. In addition to her personnel duties, and after excelling in her retail sales training, Murphy was assigned to the lingerie department. Her assignment to this department was particularly important as it was a heavy sales department that typically excluded African Americans. Traditionally, whites objected to African Americans whom they regarded as unclean and diseased. They objected to them handling their intimate clothing. And so oftentimes what you see in department stores is that that lingerie departments are the last departments to actually get integrated in department stores. Shaw and Murphy, however, were not anomalies. A Black woman who started as an inspector wrapper in the children's clothing department in 1942 was promoted to head of stock of this department after several years of strong performance. Now, after the war, the department store movement takes a different turn. In the 1950s and 1960s, it begins holding behind-the-scenes meetings with store officials and executed successful lunch counter sit-ins and selective patronage programs. These campaigns relied on worker-consumer alliances, and unlike earlier efforts, often challenged racial discrimination in labor and consumption simultaneously. And so this is the case. I want to share with you one example, and it's the case of W.T. Grant's discount department store, otherwise known as a Five and Dime, in Charlotte, North Carolina. So in 1960, influenced by the Greensboro sit-in, university and college students staged sit-ins in downtown Charlotte stores, and W.T. Grant's is one of them. Now, protesters, when they get there, had fixated on democratizing consumption. However, as they waited to be served, and they would be served by Black waitresses, they began to form an alliance with these Black waitresses. And they broadened the movement's scope and breadth to win concessions around consumption and employment. So I should explain, W.T. Grant's had two lunch counters. One lunch counter was for all whites, which was up on the main level. And on a lower level, there was a all black lunch counter. Now, there were differences also in food and staff. The staff for the Black lunch counter was overwhelmingly Black. And the food for the Black lunch counter was more like concession food, hot dogs, hamburgers, chips, easy food that could be served lukewarm, if warm at all. The white lunch counter, however, always had a very high quality protein, and always had vegetables. It was a hot meal. It was served on china, right? And the Black lunch counter, they were being served on paper plates, or at least not very good looking plates. And so you can see the differences in consumption. And so when the students came in, this is what they were thinking of. They were thinking of the ways in which they might be allowed in this space, but they're always treated as second-class citizens. So they start speaking, as they're sitting in, they start to create alliances, forge a bond with the waitresses and the waiters behind the lunch counter. And they soon begin to demand not only the integration of the lunch counter, but also of the sales staff. Selling was a major economic activity in the city of Charlotte, right? As it was in most American cities at this time. Yet Blacks held only a negligible portion of sales jobs, as such was the case in most American cities in the mid-20th century. At W.T. Grant, waitresses complained to protesters about their work conditions, especially their inability, despite repeated efforts to secure higher paying, quality, and rewarding jobs in sales. As a result of their protest, management eventually approaches a longtime waitress whose name was Dorothea Davis, and they invite her to be the sales lady in the store's lamp department. Now, the lamp department hadn't existed in years, and it was located in the basement, all the way in the back by the back door, completely out of the sight of white customers. And they believed that if they just had her go to this particular department that was closed, their white customers would never really find out, and so they wouldn't alienate their major customer base. Now, Davis is really reluctant to take this job. She's seen how those whites who were opposed to integration had treated the protesters. She also understood what it meant to be a Black first in any industry, that it's going to come with some violence, there will be some danger, there will be some threats to her family. And so before she makes her final decision, she consults with her customers, right, the protesters. And they guarantee that they'll take care of her, that they'll support her. And so after some hemming and hawing and her husband finally saying, you really, pushing her to take it, she accepts the position. And when word spread that W.T. Grant had integrated its sales force, African Americans flooded the store to show their support, both for the desegregation of the selling floor and Davis. And I should tell you that the news of the sales staff being integrated is never published in the newspaper. Right? This is all by word of mouth. And Davis recalls that, quote, I had no white clientele. This is in the early days. Because they would come in, and if they walked in, they wouldn't let you help them. They wouldn't let me help them. And word went out that I was out there. They had hired a Black salesperson, and all my support came from my people. And African American customers purchased merchandise from her department. They would even bring items from other departments, like a lipstick, to Davis's department so she could record the sale. Others simply came to visit Davis to provide moral support. And it's with their support, which is quite massive, Davis became one of the store's highest selling sales workers after only a few months. And she's eventually promoted to the jewelry department on the main level of the store, which was a big ticket item typically manned by more experienced white saleswomen. Davis also took care of her Black clientele, right? They had promised to take care of her, and they had, but she also was taking care of them. She catered to the whims and needs of her Black clientele. The relationships she cultivated with her customers as a waitress were important to her success as a saleswoman. Davis understood what these women, what her customers, women primarily, desired when shopping. She provided Black customers with the equal treatment they had long demanded and offered them a taste of first-class citizenship in the marketplace. She reinitiated the use of interpersonal relations to sell goods, an aspect of selling that was gradually losing favor as technology altered the nature of sales. And she patiently waited on Black customers, not rushing them through the purchasing process as white sales workers often did. Also, when her department didn't have a lamp or piece of furniture there that met a customer's liking, she acted as a buyer. She honed her knowledge of consumer tastes and merchandise lines, ordered and showcased items she believed would appeal to a Black middle-class aesthetic. These are items one might imagine resembled the goods and trends featured in notable Black publications, such as Ebony and Jet magazines. Years later, when Davis left W.T. Grant's to work at Lucille Vogue, a local women's clothing boutique, her female customers followed. As a result of this campaign, the number of Black sales workers doubled between 1960 and 1970. And this local movement influenced other businesses in the city of Charlotte to integrate their workforces, thus helping expand job opportunities available to African Americans beyond domestic and menial work. In the 1970s, however, the department store movement is not like the civil rights movement, right? Suburbanization had forced most department stores to close their downtown stores and move to the suburbs. In moving to the suburbs and then moving to malls, malls have been deemed private property. And so the tactics that normally had worked at a downtown department store, whereby you could picket the sidewalk, you could hold sit-in protests, no longer was viable. That, coupled with the fact that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 created the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. So by the 1970s, African Americans had virtually abandoned mass protest and turned to the newly established EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunities Commission, and the courts to challenge racial discrimination. One of the major cases actually is against Sears, Roebuck and Company. There were a series of affirmative action cases that began in the late 1970s. It was October of 1979 that the EEOC filed suit against Sears, 4 based on race and national origin discrimination, and 1 based on sex. The race cases were eventually settled out of court. The sex case, however, some of you might remember, went to trial in September of 1984 in the U.S. District Court in Chicago, where Sears was headquartered at the time, and was eventually decided in favor of the retailer in 1986. These cases effectively ended the movement. This and the radical transformation of consumption practices and labor relations. Nevertheless, the department store movement dismantled Jim Crow practices in American consumer culture and facilitated the making of a sizable contingent of sales and clerical workers of color, who now had the freedom and economic means to consume material accoutrements and services in department stores that marked them as middle class. By the 1970s, quote, 1 out of every 4 Black women in the labor force was engaged in clerical work or sales work, compared to 1 in 10 in 1960. The distribution of the Black middle class. The distribution of the Black middle class, one sociologist has documented, quote, had come to resemble the distribution of whites, meaning that there now existed a large stratum of clerical and sales workers, a smaller stratum of professionals, and an even smaller stratum of managers and small businessmen. Skip ahead a little bit. African Americans' presence in sales and office work continued to grow for the remainder of the 20th and into the 21st century. In 1995, African Americans accounted for 7.8% of all sales occupations. They were 11.4% of 6.6 million sales workers in retail and personal service. By 2014, out of nearly 33.5 million people occupying sales and office jobs, 12%, or approximately 4 million, were African Americans. Approximately 3.3 million Americans were working as retail sales workers. A little over 12% were African American. The gains made by African American as consumers, however, are better known. Widely publicized sit-ins and picket lines at department stores and five and dimes forced retailers to grant African Americans access to the marketplace on the same basis as whites. Overall, we can now freely try on and return clothes, partake in meals in store eateries, and access credit. In fact, these public accommodations, or public accommodations more generally, are the most integrated institutions in the US today. And this is important to remember because when we think about the civil rights movement, the Brown versus Board of Education case is a monumental case in the fight for civil rights. And yet schools and even housing remain some of the most segregated institutions in the US. At the same time, however, department stores are less relevant to shoppers and therefore less profitable, especially since the advent and proliferation of online shopping. This year, we will continue to see department stores close their doors. Macy's has been closing stores and is cutting corporate staff. Sears, as many of you probably hear, has closed numerous stores in the past decade or so. Last year, Barney's declared bankruptcy. Neiman Marcus recently did the same, and some project that JCPenney also will file for bankruptcy this Friday. Department stores were in dire straits before the COVID-19 pandemic. One can only imagine what their future will look like in subsequent months, as we've all become very reliant on everything being delivered to our homes. As for labor and consumption in stores, those jobs remain, at least department stores and sales clerical work, are now considered dead-end jobs. They're lower middle-class jobs. No longer do they have the same responsibilities, the status and prestige that they once did. Sales workers are cashiers and stock people for all intents and purposes. If you actually need a sales worker, because at this point you can go into the Stop and Shop, do all of your shopping, and check your stuff out. Rarely do you need the cashier. One historian has observed, quote, like other service industry workers, salespeople have experienced a continuation of the trend toward part-time work. Pressures for increased productivity, closer surveillance through computers and industrial espionage, and low pay. The nature of consumption has also changed, or more accurately, deteriorated, from full-service shopping to self-service shopping. No longer is all merchandise housed in glass cases or out of reach of customers, as you might recall of the G-Fox, the second set of photos I showed you from G-Fox. Forgive me. No longer are they out of reach of customers. No longer are sales workers dressed in all black or in their Sunday best. No longer are salespeople experts in the art of selling and the merchandise they sold. And no longer are these stores places where visitors have their every desire and whims fulfilled. Now customers are more knowledgeable about identifying and locating their desired merchandise, in large part because of modern advertising, and thus are less reliant on salespeople to assist them through the shopping process. And I just wanted to show you a couple of images of the effect of the closing of department stores is having on other retail institutions. So once department stores anchor malls, once the department stores close, what we find is that the specialty stores eventually close as well, whether they decide that it's no longer profitable to remain there or they're run out of business. And what we're increasingly seeing are these dead malls throughout the United States. The struggle for racial equity and work and consumption, however, continues. Racial discrimination in the retail industry persists in ways that are consistent with early forms of discrimination. Not hiring African Americans in skilled and status positions, and limiting Black consumers' mobility in and access to retail institutions. This often looks like African Americans being falsely targeted for shoplifting and theft. It's a phenomenon that is regularly called shopping while Black. Discrimination is also shaped by and reflective of the changing nature of American retailing, employment and consumption in the 21st century. And that African Americans are hired in sales vis-a-vis cashiering and denied managerial and supervisory positions, for example. Perhaps the fate of department stores may take a turn. I'm not that optimistic today, but maybe tomorrow I will be. Maybe they'll become key sites of consumption and labor. Many have placed their bets, but no one really knows. What we do know, however, is that 20th century department stores offered African Americans a site where they could effectively challenge racial discrimination and segregation and advance the economic agenda of the civil rights movement. They also provided them with a place where they could secure modernity and middle-class citizenship. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Parker. Perfect. It's going to end your slideshow and we'll open up for Q&A.
Thank you.
Okay, so we have a couple ways of doing this. You can physically show me your hand if you have your video on and you want to say something. You can add something to the chat box, So I saw Bill's hand up first. Bill, if you'd like to unmute yourself and ask Dr. Parker a question, you can do that. Yeah, perfect.
Oh, well, one of the highlights of my Christmas activity was shopping at G Fox, because everything you said about the personnel there, and of course, I wouldn't recognize Black people other than those operating the elevators or so forth. But I do recall that there were very few Black people shopping when I was shopping. But the service was so extensive in terms of you can get your shoes shined, you get shoes. I mean, it wasn't anything that I needed that I couldn't get at G Fox, including meals. And you had the quickie, and then you had the sit down portion. I mean, it was, and they tell stories. I had when Elizabeth Abbey was doing the G Fox and hula hoop routine, which was a fantastic program. And Mrs. Carmen, Nan Carmen of the Carmen funeral family here in Windsor, had was getting married, and her husband was leaving for the war, and her mother called G Fox and ordered a dress. G Fox sent 3 or 4 samples out to the house, and she selected one, and then took measurements and so forth. And they literally finished the dress, brought it back within a short period of time, and had her fitted for a quick wedding before he left for the war. Wow. And Anne was telling this experience, which was just, and it was so true about G Fox and particularly Mrs. Arbach in terms of how she managed the store and how she treated people was just amazing. So, but I appreciate your talk about the other part of it in terms of how African Americans were treated differently during many years.
Yeah, I don't know whether we'll ever get to a point where a site of consumption of retailers do look like what they once looked like.
Yeah, no,
I mean, it's become so. I mean, Walmart is sort of the place where you could get everything, your groceries, the super Target, but it doesn't have the same allure and feeling and service that department stores once had.
Yeah, absolutely. Yep.
Thank you, Bill. I see Kevin's hand is up. I'm gonna unmute you, Kevin.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Dr. Parker. That was a very, very interesting discussion, and I'm definitely going to look up your book. I want to make one comment, and then I want to ask a question. Mm-hmm. I grew up in rural Indiana, and about 60 miles from Indianapolis, 60 miles from Terre Haute. And just another comment about the department store phenomenon in African Americans. Growing up in rural Indiana, which was predominantly white, I mean, where I lived, it wasn't Kokomo, but we had very few Black families in the town. And going to the department stores in Indianapolis and Terre Haute, LS Ayres in Indianapolis and Roots in Terre Haute, that was our interaction with African American. I mean, that was my first introduction to African Americans. In terms of seeing them in the same roles that we saw them in downtown rural Indiana. So I think that was another important, by that time, that was important. My quick question for you, obviously, in your presentation, you sort of paint Ms. Arbach as being somewhat progressive in terms of this. I was just wondering if, if you did any research on that, and if it had to do with her friendship with Eleanor Roosevelt, if that was part of the reason for that. Thank you.
So I don't know. It's funny. There's a lot. That collection, G Fox, is massive. It's wonderful if you ever get a chance to go through it. And there's very little about her work in integrating the department store staff. And I don't know whether that was a personal, people, when they donate these records, you can have things taken out. And so I don't know whether this is personal. I don't know why it's not there. But what I do know is that I ended up instead trying to trace how long African Americans had been working there. And what I did find is that for those who started, they would remain for decades. Like there is a loyalty between her and her black store workers that I think is very rare to find. The only other place that I saw that was actually the Macy's in New York City in Herald Square. Um, and I suspect that's actually not about the bond they had with the store and the store owners, but rather the bond that they had with the union, the labor union that operated that department store. But there's so many questions I have about her in particular. And she seems to be a very private woman in that respect. But yeah, I don't know.
Okay, I see B's physical hand up.
Yes, I grew up in Bloomfield, and the first job that I had was at G. Fox.
Yeah.
That was in 1956. And everything that you said about Beatrice Auerbach is true. I was hired without a question. I was trained and began working there. And I worked summers and holidays, Christmas and all, until I went to college. And what I will say is that although there was no discrimination as such, I knew that as a minority, I had to be better. I had to sell better. I had to present better. And I was taken under the wing of another coworker who happened to be minority. And through that guidance, rose up to become a contingent. And I worked all over G. Fox on the many floors at the times that I was there. I think that we were very fortunate here in this area because I know for sure when you went south, that things were very, very different.
Yeah.
And my question to you is, have you compared the two situations and come to any conclusions there?
I have. So Hartford seems to be an odd anomaly. And I really thank you for telling me that story. That's wonderful. What I did find is that your neighboring Boston, very different experience in department stores. That they had to protest. There were a lot of picket lines. There was a lot of refusal. Most of the hires in positions of responsibility, sales or clerical work, were token hires for the most part. And in the South, so the difference I have found between the North and the South, and I find that the movement starts in the North and it moves south. It starts in the North, moves west to Chicago, and then moves south. The difference between what happens in the North and the Midwest, at least Chicago, is that store owners are usually more willing to hire before they get to the point of protest, right? So they would hold these behind these closed door meetings, and typically they could convince them to hire maybe one or two very, very fair African Americans who would go unnoticed, and then increase the amount of hires. In the South, this really required those mass movements that have been pictured, that people remember plastering their television screens, and that people were losing their lives over, and they would lose their livelihood. The South was just way more resistant, and yet they hired, and in part because they really wanted that rigid racial line to be maintained. In the North, the cities increasingly, that line could move at any moment to some degree, right? As increasing amount of African Americans are moving up to northern cities with the Great Migration, and they're changing neighborhoods and spatial, changing their proximity to whites. And so it's very, not to say that whites in the North were much better, it's just that they didn't, or rather I would say maybe they feared the boycott and protest. They didn't want they were very adamant about not wanting bad publicity. But the Quakers, I will say, were also really big in trying to integrate department stores. Surprisingly, I don't know why Quakers. But they took up the call for department stores, and they were very. Um, they would go in daily and meet with these store managers to convince them to hire African Americans. They worked with the Urban League, and they did surveys where they would survey white customers coming out of the door from shopping and say, would you be bothered if, would you have a problem if there was an African American selling you your good? And what they learned is that white customers didn't care. They just wanted their goods.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, B. I see that one of the two Davids has his electronic hand up, so I'm going to unmute you, David. Oh. Hold on, David.
Okay.
Sorry.
Sorry, Dr. Parker. I had to rush out. Didn't hear the end of your talk because we had two very large bears in our backyard and took out all our bear feeders, and these guys are huge. Anyway, interesting topic. I never stopped to think about it, but the department store is was a very adequate stage for the convergence of consumerism and social justice, because prior to the 1950s, there really wasn't any consumerism. There was just rich people buying what they needed or what they needed to go to the next party. But that was a small amount of consumerism. After the war and in the 50s, it exploded. So it was maybe a combination of trying to do the right thing and building a bigger market share that converged at this time that really made it worth noting. But I haven't found anybody yet comparable to Mrs. Auerbach in terms of who she was, how she ran her store, and the policies by which she ran them. Really rather remarkable.
Yeah, she really is an anomaly in my study. It was for a while there, I was like, I don't know what to do with her. The closest I think I found to someone like her, and this is still kind of far off, is that there's a department store in Chicago, Carson Prairie Scott. And so that was the first department store to integrate in Chicago. And that was the result of the American Friends Service Committee, the Quaker group, traveling to Chicago to convince them to hire. And they do. They hire an African American from the South who's got a college degree, and if I remember correctly, an MBA, to be their head of personnel for Black workers. And because he does a good job, they go back and they ask for more employees. And so increasingly they have more employees that are hired, but she seemed to, everything that I've heard, every time I talk to someone about her, she seemed to have this sense of humanism, this sense of social justice that may have been quiet and unspoken and didn't require a lot of hullabaloo and fanfare. She just did it through the work. And so I find her to be quite impressive.
Yeah. Have you felt there's any comparable stage for the next growth, not growth. Well, this was a staging place for not only consumer growth, but economism and integration. While we're still working in that direction, what's likely to be the next likely stage for that activity? Do you have a feeling?
I have no idea. I spent so much time talking about department stores that when I ended the book, I was thinking about where does this go, right? Where does the movement now go? And now we're in the middle of a pandemic and we're all in our homes all the time. So I don't know. There's every year I ask my students, I teach a class on the history of the civil rights movement, and I ask them what they think the next step is, because that's their generation. I don't know, I have yet to get an answer that I love. I mean, they're all addicted to Twitter and Instagram.
Yeah.
And so I think those are excellent platforms for galvanizing people. I don't think they're excellent platforms for maintaining a movement and really forcing people to change their policies. So I don't know. I mean, I always try to convince them to vote. So that's
That's good enough. That's a tough challenge.
Yeah, they've lost hope in voting. So.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, Ruth Ann has her hand up. Let me unmute you, Ruth Ann.
Thank you.
Go for it.
You know, I confessed early in this program that number one, I was excited about what Traci had to say, but also I have a fascination with Mrs. Auerbach as well. And I really wonder if the fact that she was Jewish helped. I did not grow up in Connecticut. I didn't see G. Fox until the late 60s. But growing up in Long Island, I had plenty of Jewish friends, and I continue to have them. And there's we wouldn't have the ADL without Jewish people. There's something where there's an understanding that I keep wondering about if that was just an understanding she had. And Traci, I wonder if I don't know if you'll do it or if someone else will do it, but I still think there's something about plumbing the depths of her soul
Yeah.
to see where it was, what it was from. But people I know who I was lucky enough to know who worked with her or for her or in the Women's Bureau, she certainly was a feminist. Mm-hmm. And way before it was cool. But I think who could understand this like someone who's Jewish? I mean, they have been wrongly persecuted for so many years, and Hartford had a huge Jewish contingent. Bloomfield does, thankfully, as well. And I wonder about it.
Yeah, I think you're onto something. I think being Jewish, particularly in the midst of World War II,
yes, oh, yes,
probably motivates you. I also think that it's probably a collision of different things. Her being Jewish, the location, she's in Hartford, Connecticut,
with many Jews.
Right, with many Jews, also with a population of African Americans that's not necessarily comparable to a southern city or a city like Chicago or New York. Her feminism, I think all of these things did something to shape her philosophy on life and labor and consumption and she just, because when I look at other Jewish store presidents, many of whom are in Baltimore had a large Jewish community.
Okay.
They could care less. It takes them a really long time.
Might they have been men?
Yes, they were men. There are a number of women who were very vocal. They did a bunch of oral histories before they passed away, who said they were not for African American women in particular, to be hired to work next to them. Mm. But that's also, Baltimore, again, is one of those cities that we treat as a oddly northern city because it's not deep south, but it's very southern in its racial relations. And so I suspect that actually had something to do.
Well, I wish you would go back and study Beatrice Fox Auerbach, because Kevin asked earlier if Eleanor Roosevelt influenced her, but I think they influenced each other, frankly.
I could see that. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. That makes sense to me.
This work is so important. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, Marshall has his digital hand up. Marshall, would you like to go next?
Sure. I would just like to say a couple of things. One of which was a story that my mother told me years ago. I used to go shopping with her at G. Fox when I was a little kid. And first of all, around that time, it was their 100th, I think it was around 1948 or so, was their 100th anniversary of the original store that her father had started, Gershon Fox. And there was a large, what was like what you would call today a tabletop book, hardcover book, and they gave them out to people that came to the store. And I remember having it, and I had it after my parents passed away, or my parents had it. I couldn't find it when they passed away. But at any rate, my mother had told me about a story that, and this talks about the type of store that Beatrice Auerbach ran. A friend of hers told her that she had a carpet in her house for 3 years, that she had bought it at G. Fox and Company, and the dog urinated on the carpet. She called Fox's, and Fox's replaced the carpet free.
Oh,
So, yeah. So
never happened to me.
and my mother never told a lie. So I know that was true. And then years later, when toward the end of her life, she was a client of our office. And one day I saw her, and I didn't usually see her. I wasn't the partner that dealt with her, but I was walking through the hall, and I saw her walking with my partner who did deal with her. And so I stopped her and I told her about how I remembered that book of the 100th anniversary, which was this. Now this took place probably in 2010 or so, something like that. So it's many years later. And I told her that we had that book originally and we couldn't find it. And about 2 weeks later, I found a package in my office. Wow. And it wasn't that book, but there were 2 other books about G. Fox that she had brought up to my office. But that's the kind of person she was.
That's wonderful.
She just cared. She cared about people.
Yeah.
It didn't matter, what kind of people. It didn't matter what color, what country they came from, or anything. It was just she cared about people.
That's wonderful. Thank you for sharing those stories.
You're welcome.
Does anybody else have any questions or comments for Dr. Parker? If you don't have your video on, you can do a digital hands up. We'll go to Bill next if nobody else raises their hand. Digital hands up under participants. You can also add it to the chat and I'll unmute you. Oh, I see one thing in the chat, let me make sure. So Alice had added to the chat earlier that she was born in Hartford in 1951 and worked in G. Fox after school, age 16. Her mother worked in Sage Allen department store right next to G. Fox for 35 years. And she just added, it was really amazing that as a youth, I was very naive and almost unaware of the racism that existed in our Hartford society. Thank God for raising up people like Beatrice Fox Auburn.
Wow. That's amazing.
Okay, we'll go to Bill.
I just wanted to add a comment with regard to what Bea had said earlier about she had to perform better than a white person. At least that's the way she felt. And I think it traces back to somehow, in my mind, to Ruth Ann's comments about the Jewish part and the fact that she was more sensitive because of her Jewishness and the experiences that they went through, especially during World War II. But there are many minorities who feel that they have to perform better than their associates because they are at a disadvantage. And I think we're the beneficiaries of that attitude, which unfortunately is not very evident today. Not as evident today. But anyway, thank you, Traci, very much. I appreciate it.
Oh, you're welcome. I was going to say that a lot of department stores, Chicago was one of them, those in Baltimore were some, New York, that in order to be a sales worker, you had to have a college degree. And if you were white, some of them may have had a high school diploma, many of them didn't. So the fact that there's a feeling that you have to perform better than your white counterparts is absolutely true, given that the requirements when they finally do integrate are just so ridiculous, right, to sell. And so a lot of African Americans not only had a college degree, but they would also do special training with the National Urban League. And so they would go through all these sales classes and typing classes, and they were just way overqualified.
Okay, I see David's hand up, and then I saw Alice unmuted herself. So after David's done speaking, Alice, if you want to say something.
Okay.
Just a quick comment. I see by the faces here, most of us lived through this period of the 50s and 60s, the civil rights movement, and but may not have had direct contact with it. I can tell you that if you're ever in Atlanta, the Civil Rights Museum down there has an excellent exhibit. You can actually sit yourself at the Grant's lunch counter, and through all kinds of electronic means, you are having the experience that a lot of those Black young people had back in the day. It's shocking. So if you're ever there, just check it out. But I think that's the part that maybe I missed or you didn't get into was the pain of protest and in our society, and it still goes on. But
I always, when I teach the class, there's a clip in the movie The Butler that shows students preparing to do because people think it was so spontaneous, that these students really had prepared to do this work, to sit at these lunch counters, and they would have their colleagues throw things at them, yell at them, just so they were prepared, at least somewhat prepared for what they were to expect.
Yeah.
But it's
no
amazing.
preparation.
There's no real preparation for that at all.
No.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Okay. Hi, this is Alice.
Hi, Alice.
Hi. Your presentation was wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.
And I almost need to take that back about being unaware of racism in our Hartford society, but I really was unaware. I think I became aware of it around the age of 12 or 13 when John Kennedy, our president, at the time was, concerned about racial injustice. And then Martin Luther King came along, 1968 came along. I was at Weber High School at the time and was very aware of racism. But regarding the department store experience, that was wonderful. So thank God for Beatrice Fox, our back, and whoever ran Sage Allen department store, because my mother worked there 35 years. She worked in the lingerie department, and she was well accepted and sent to Old Saybrook store and some of the other stores to do their inventory or whatever it was. So she was well accepted by her own boss, which was Mrs. Shanley. I don't remember her first name. But, thank God for him raising up people to pave the way for others. So this is a good presentation, and thank you. And the title of your book again?
Department Stores in the Black Freedom Movement.
Okay, is it in the library, or you got to get it on Amazon or what?
Amazon. You can buy it in Amazon, the library. It was published by the University of North Carolina Press, and so you could purchase it directly from them as well. Yeah.
Okay. Is that part of your thesis or dissertation or whatever?
So it was initially a dissertation, and then I published it as a book. Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Alice, we have it on order at the Bloomfield Library. If you want a copy, you can contact us. I'll be at the branch tomorrow, 7 to 6.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I know Ruth Ann has her hand up. Let me unmute you, Ruth Ann. Go for it.
Thank you. I will ask Dick Pierce. I will send him an email because he's wonderful about doing this. And we will put the Amazon link to Traci's book on the Wintonberry Historical Society as well. And that way, anybody who wishes to buy her book can buy it, and people who wish to take it out can go to the library. But it's a book worthy of having. I only wish we would all be together so we have books for you to autograph for us, Traci.
Thank you.
Dr. Parker, can you share what you are working on now?
Sure. I have been for the past year writing a book on sex, love, and marriage and the civil rights and Black Power movement. So right now I'm focusing on the Black Power movement. It just turned out because I could get do a lot of interviews at one time because everybody's home. So I've been interviewing former Black Panthers about their marriages. They would get married in what was called revolutionary marriages. And part of the vows, which I find fascinating, is part of the vows are very traditional Christian vows, and then they would, quote parts of Marx or Mao. And so it was clearly a marriage of two people, but also a marriage to the movement. And so that's what I've been currently working on.
Thank you. Does anybody else have any questions or comments? Okay, I'll do my little blurb about the library since I forgot to do it at the beginning. I just wanted to highlight some programs that are happening next week. We have line dancing with Heidi on Monday night. On Wednesday afternoon, we have pollinators in your garden with the Bloomfield Beautification Committee. I run weekly book chats. They're totally informal chats just here on Zoom to talk about what you're reading, get book recommendations. It's a great way to connect during this time. And on Friday mornings, I also run a kitchen and garden chat, which is kind of open to talk about what you're cooking, what you're doing in your garden, to keep us all connected. We're also working hard on planning a summer reading program that starts June 15th. So we have programs for all ages, straight across the board, and we offer curbside pickup. So if you guys need books, want print books, DVDs, all materials, give us a call 11 to 6 and we'll pull them for you. And we do have ebooks available as well. So you could always reach out to me. I'll put my email in the chat so everybody has that. We also have special things like New York Times access right now that's free and open. I think Ancestry is still open right now from home. I didn't see an end date for that yet. Lots of special things going on, all at bplct.org. This will be recorded and added to our YouTube channel, and I'll see if I could share it for Ruth Ann to put a link onto the website as well for Historical Society. So I'm going to put my email in there. I'm going to unmute everybody just in case anybody has any final things they want to jump in with real quick.
Sarah, I have a question. You can call the library for pickups from your collection. Are you taking? I have a bunch of books. I have several books that were taken out before the pandemic that need to go back to other libraries. Are you doing? Can I drop them off and they go back?
Yep, you can drop them off. We can't request books from other libraries to be sent to us, but you can definitely drop them off. Both of our book drops are open.
Good, thank you.
Marshall.
Yeah, just one other thing. Somebody mentioned talking about Beatrice Auerbach about the ownership of Sage Allen also, which was next door. Or a couple of there was a Brown Thompson.
Oh, that's what it was.
But the ownership of Sage Allen, I don't know about Sage, but Allen was Ned Allen, whose wife, he was actually the governor of Connecticut at one time, and his wife was later the Secretary of State of Connecticut. And Ned Allen, his wife, Mildred, who became Secretary of State, grew up on the same street as my father. They were about the same age back in 1912 to 1918, in that era. And Ned Allen was not Jewish. Mildred was Jewish, so it was a mixed marriage. But Mildred had nothing to do with the department store.
Thank you.
Did you mention curbside pickup?
Yeah.
So you order it online and then?
So we prefer if you give us a call and we can connect your library card to whatever items you want. If you put holds on online that we own, we can look at your record and pull those, but we need that phone call. The online holds is a little tricky right now because of the delivery system.
And we can help you with Reader's Advisory too. If you don't know what you're interested in, you can just call us and say, hey, I'd like some new mysteries or some new nonfiction, and we can let you know what we have. You can also tell us what types of books you like to read, and we can make some recommendations. All of our staff are trained to do that, and we look forward to talking with our patrons. So give us a call and let us know what you like.
Well, I miss having a library open.
I know.
Still very close. Yeah.
We know, and we have many services. We are one of the only libraries that have offered the curbside delivery service from the get-go. And we just rolled out a new print service. So if you're someone who needs some printouts, you can call us. If it's a tax form or whatever, you can email it to us and we'll print it out for you and deliver that for pickup. And we're being really mindful about that and trying to be as accessible as possible, and really trying to overcome the digital divide, which we're seeing is very deep in Bloomfield. Ruth Ann?
Thank you. I just want to say, first of all, thank you, Tracy, again and again. But though I'm representing the Winterberry Historical Society, I'm also very active in the Friends of the Library. And those of you who aren't should be, because we do support the summer reading program, and these extras really matter. Elizabeth couldn't be more clear. I wish Bloomfield had more money. I wish everybody in Bloomfield had an iPad or something digital. We don't. And so the library is an essential place to print things, to be accessed. And I can't thank you enough, Elizabeth and Sarah and all you library staff, for everything you do. Thank you.
I have some I can give you.
You're welcome. Okay, so I guess we'll end here. Feel free to send me an email if there's anything you're looking for, programs that you want. We're moving forward with lots of virtual happenings. So.
And your email address again, please?
Yep, it's Sarah Ray. So my name is SARARAY at libraryconnection.info.
Okay.
And Alice, I'll be at McMahon Winterberry tomorrow too. If you want to connect, I can help pull some books for you and order them for Grasso too.
And
okay,
one more
I was
question
concerned.
for Dr. Parker. Oh, sorry.
I was interested in finding out about getting items printed.
Yeah.
If I have documents that I need printed, how do I go about doing that?
Yeah, do you have internet at home?
Yes, I'm on my computer now.
Perfect. You can email them to me, or we could talk over the phone, and I can go to the websites that you need printed, and we'll put them in an envelope and put them out for curbside when you get to the library.
Okay, and when are you available to speak with?
Well, both libraries are staffed 11 to 6. Me particularly, 11 to 1 would be really good tomorrow before my back-to-back meetings and programs. So if you wanted to call me at 11 tomorrow at the branch, I give you their phone number if you want.
No, I have it.
Okay.
I'm usually asleep at that time, but
call me closer to 1 or even later.
Okay.
I had a question for Dr. Parker. Where can we follow you on social media?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm like horrible at the computer. Wait a second. So it's like awful. On Twitter, it's at Traci Linnea, I believe. TraciLynnea. You can actually check so I don't give you the wrong. I had to get a student to like train me in Twitter at some point. that's how. Yes. So I'm right. That's the Twitter at, and I can type it here too. And then Instagram, I think it might be the same. Oh, it's just this. So that's Instagram. There we go.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
And those are in the chat box for anybody else that's interested in seeing what she typed. Okay. So we will end here. Thank you all. Have a good night.
Thank you, Dr. Parker. Thank you.
Have a good night.